Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to explain what frames per second means. Some of you might not know what that means and you're like thinking, that sounds kind of intimidating, let's just forget about it. Don't worry, by the end of this video, you'll have a full understanding what frames per second mean. Some of you might need a refresher, and some of you might think you know what frames per second means, but you might have the false information, because there are a lot of people on the internet, I realize, that don't know what frames per second is. So what I'm going to do is actually explain it, and then actually show it to you, so by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what frames per second means. And when you're purchasing, say, a new camcorder in the future, you know exactly what to look for. So basically, the concept of frames per second, well, maybe you've seen it in stores. Whenever you see like a camera, it says records in 30 FPS. That actually means it records in 30 frames per second. FPS is frames per second. So basically what it means is it's literally taking, say something's 30 frames per second, it's taking 30 pictures per second. Think of it kind of like that. I guess it's the most basic way to explain it. So what's happening is that the less frames per second you have, the less images are being taken by your camcorder in a second. So things will just look like 1 second my arm will be here, and then a second later my arm will be here, if it's 1 frames per second. So I think many of you might have seen it on TV or someone just goofing around at the office or something. If you ever see someone basically taking a notepad and drawing a little cartoon here in the corner, and they start flicking the pages and the cartoon they draw animates on a notepad, that's basically the concept of frames per second. The amount of pages they can flicker in a second is how many frames per second they're showing you. So that's enough of the explanation. It's probably just easier to show you guys, so I'm going to show you that just now, okay? Okay, so at this point, basically what you're saying is 1 frames per second. I'm moving my arms around. You might see them teleporting here and there. That's because 1 frame per second is extremely slow and laggy. You will never see this kind of technology available for purchasing or use, but at least you get the idea. Now let's move up to 5 frames per second. Okay, so at this point, we move up to 5 frames per second. And you might see my lips moving around. I'm kind of moving my body left and right. It'll kind of look like a bad, cheap cartoon. Maybe like how South Park was when it first started out. That's kind of how South Park was, really lame frames per second. So yeah, you know, I might seem like a South Park character, maybe like Eric Cartman.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching Babbling Boolean, but screw you guys, and we're going home.
And yeah, that's my lame impression. So now I'm going to move up to 10 frames per second. Okay, between 1 and 5 frames per second, you might have seen a big difference. Between 5 and 10, maybe not as much. We're in 10 frames per second right now. And yeah, you see my arms are waving a little bit. It'll look like a very cheap webcam, I guess you can say, when you're looking at someone else from their webcam. That's kind of like what it'll look like at 10 frames per second. What I'm going to do is actually jump to 20, and then from there we're going to go to 30, and you'll see what exactly the difference is. Okay, so at this point we're at 20 frames per second, waving my arms again, just so you can get an idea. And at this point, basically, this is what cell phones used to record at, the cheaper, older smartphones that came out maybe a year ago, as of this posting. Actually more like 2 years ago. You get like 20 frames per second recording on a 2-year-old cell phone camera, if you're lucky. Just recently, in the last year or so, they started hitting 30. 30's become the norm. So at this point, we're going to move on to 30, okay? Okay, so at this point, I'm recording in... Sorry, I thought someone was there. I'm recording at 30 frames per second, and you'll see that I'm dancing, you know, I'm moving. You'll see that it's fairly smooth. Things are moving pretty well. That's because 30 frames per second is a norm when you watch a TV show or a movie. About 99% of the movies and TV shows you watch are played back in 30 frames per second. So what I'm going to do is actually show you in the next clip 60 frames per second, which is really rare to see, even though technology for it is ancient. Not ancient, but decades old. So the only way you can see it is by actually downloading the file in the description below. The reason being is because I couldn't find one website, including YouTube. They all cap off at playing 30 frames per second. So the only way you can see past 30 frames per second is to download the video file in the description below, play it back, and let's just get straight into it, shall we? Oh, and yes, one thing I want to explain. If you ever see anyone on the internet say that your human eye cannot handle 60 frames per second, they don't know what they're talking about. The human eye can handle more than 60 frames per second. Just, you know, go to a race, a car race or something, you'll see cars just zoom by at like 200 kilometers an hour. I don't know how many miles that is, but whatever. And yeah, you can see it fairly smooth. So don't listen to anyone that says 60 frames per second is useless, it doesn't know what they're talking about. No, they don't know what they're talking about. So let's just get into it, and we'll just continue from there. Alright, and so in this segment, I'm recording this video at 60 frames per second. Although if you're watching it on YouTube, you won't see anything too special about it. And the reason being is because anything that's recorded at 30 frames per second or higher, when you upload it on YouTube, it'll play back at 30 frames per second. It's a limitation of YouTube. It caps at 30 frames per second. So basically you won't see what exactly I'm talking about. For those of you that have downloaded this clip and you watch it on your computer, you'll notice that when I'm spinning around, it looks a bit too smooth. Like it's kind of being fast forwarded slightly. And the reason for that is because the human eye is not used to seeing 60 frames per second, at least on a screen. The technology is really old. It's been out for decades and decades. It's just Hollywood hasn't adapted to it. They haven't adopted it too much because audiences decades ago just didn't like it. They thought it was a bit too smooth for their eye. And to prove that this clip is not actually fast forwarded if you downloaded this file and not watching on YouTube, is that you'll see from my lips the audio is not at a sync. So the clip is not fast forwarded at all. So this is what it looks like. This is the full potential of 60 frames per second. You're just getting everything a lot smoother. And the odd thing is, if you try playing this with an advanced program like VLC Player on your computer, for some reason VLC Player caps off at 30 frames per second as well. Oddly enough, Windows Media Player plays it just fine. It plays back the full 60 frames per second, which I find really odd because Windows Media Player is the most basic of media players available. So it's an MTS file type. Windows Media Player should be able to run it. If not, find a codec to play MTS files on Windows Media Player and it should work just fine. And there was someone walking by. He's probably looking at me, thought I'm talking to myself right now. Thought I'm a weirdo. So anyway, yeah, try to use Windows Media Player to play it back. Don't use VLC or something else. It just won't play 60 frames per second. Windows Media Player will. So it's just a demonstration. And the funny thing is, if you're watching this for the first time, you probably think 60 frames per second when I turn around is too smooth. Like I said, it's going fast forward mode. If you put this exact clip back on YouTube after watching the 60 frames per second, the file, you'll think that the YouTube version, which is 30 frames per second, is actually lagging, like it's too slow. That's because your brain has already slowly adjusted to 60 frames per second and how smooth the picture is moving. So do give it a shot. If you're watching this on YouTube, try to download the file. I assure you there are no viruses. Yeah, watch that file, then watch the YouTube version again, which is this clip you're watching right now. And you'll see that there's a big difference in smoothness from left to right. If I had more moving objects, like I had some cars driving by, you'll notice that they move smoother on 60 frames per second. Obviously this person's slowing down, so you won't get the full effect, but you get the gist of it, right? So I hope this helps explain what 60 frames per second is and what kind of great quality is that people need to start using and accepting because it's superb. Right, so if you found this video useful, check out my website, hit the like button, it does help, and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.